So I'm Fiona Place. I work for a company called Anthesis, and we are a sustainability consultancy. The exciting thing about Anthesis is that we have really deep technical expertise, but we work across a really, really broad range of countries globally, from North America, so the US and Canada, through to Finland, France, Italy, Germany, and so on, and then across to China and the Philippines. And that really enables us to understand a lot of the risks and challenges that our clients are facing, however small an organisation they might be, and kind of leverage all of that knowledge and expertise to help you find the interventions and the actions to make the change that we need to see. And we are a Workspace customer as well.
Hi, I'm Karen Jamison. I'm Head of Sustainability at Workspace. I work with all of the teams across Workspace to reduce our environmental impact. And I'm responsible for our environmental performance, meeting our targets and regulatory requirements. And I report into various ESG indices, which basically benchmark us against our real estate peers on environmental, social and governance performance. And I just thought I'd share a couple of environmental features of this building that we're in right now.
Yeah, come on.
So we've reused 65% of the existing foundations. We've installed 202 square metres of solar PV on the roof. And we've installed smart metering across the whole centre, which means that our facilities managers can look at our energy consumption across the building and then also access and control the building's heating and cooling remotely as well. That's me.
Yeah.
That's great. That's when sustainability starts to look really good. To really sell it. Hi, I'm Leah. I'm the Sustainability Policy Advisor at the British Retail Consortium. We are the membership and trade organization for UK retailers. We represent about 70% of UK retail, those that are based in the UK but also based overseas but operate in the UK as well. And my job title, pretty much, I do what it says on the tin. I advise on policies as they relate to sustainability. And that means different things for different types of retailers, mainly responsible sourcing of products, whether that's organic cotton or leather, recycled polyester for fashion retailers, but even down to, for the food guys, sustainable palm oil, soya, timber, making sure that we're tackling these big issues like climate change and deforestation. We can launch into that. But yeah, really happy to be here. I'm really interested to hear from all of my panelists about how to work together and collaborate. I'll be banging on about collaboration a lot, so it's important.
Thank you very much. Louisa.
Hi, I'm Louisa Zayan. I'm from Toast Ale. And so we brew craft beer with surplus bread from the sandwich industry, and all of our profits go to charities that are seeking to fix the food system. Food production is the biggest impact that we have on the planet. It's the biggest contributor to climate change and biodiversity loss, and yet we waste a third of everything that we produce. So we want to change that with a cheeky pint.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Partuck from Forum for the Future. I'm the Director of our UK and Europe operations. So Forum for the Future is a non-profit working primarily with businesses, and we work with them one-to-one on their sustainability strategies, often really over quite a long period of time, and working with them to update that on kind of long-term future horizons to make sure they're going to stay fit for purpose with changing external environments. But we also work a lot in collaborations, so totally echo what you were saying there, Leah. So trying to bring together different players across a particular sector around a particular challenge. So pre-competitive collaborations, so where there's a common problem, perhaps around plastic packaging, for example, bringing together the actors from across that who all are experiencing that and working with them to try and find solutions to that. And the key couple of things that are real identifiers about how we work is that we work using systems thinking, so very much thinking about the entire landscape, so political, economic, social, and so on. But also we use futures And by that, I mean qualitative futures, not quantitative futures, and really looking at signals of change and clustering those together and projecting forward as to what that might mean for what world we're going to be living in 10, 20 years from now, and really thinking about what the impacts of that kind of world will be and what we need to do now to try and make those outcomes better.
So let's stick with you, Hannah. I guess looking at the audience profile, I think certainly the strategic view of this issue is really important. Starting off with that first question around the practical actions business leaders can implement within their business to address climate change. Please start off.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we see, sort of the most critical enabler for success, is actually not around sort of the operational things like carbon footprint and so on. Those are all incredibly important, but almost the first sort of point of whether you're going to be successful or not as a business in your sustainability endeavours is really around mindsets, because the problems that we are facing now are a construct of the world that we humans have created. So really, in order to be able to change that, you have to tackle the mindset issues that we are facing. So actually, much of our work is around surfacing what are those mindsets and what are the ones that are enablers or barriers to being able to change. And then once you've started to work with kind of on quite a psychological and emotional level, really, and really work with people kind of as individuals, not just kind of as a business, as kind of a corporate entity, is then you start to be able to see some shifts in narratives. So, you know, I think we've seen a lot of narrative shift around plastics and single-use plastics, for example. And it's very different now than it was maybe a couple of years ago. But it really has to start on that mindset level. And then you're able to go into the more operational and tactical things like carbon footprinting and so on, and move from there.
How do I make that first jump in mindset? If I accept the premise that actually this is an interesting way to approach this issue, what's a real practical next step around this mindset approach?
One of the main ways that we often do that is through using trend cards. And what I mean by that is we will look at, for a particular kind of business, is we will gather together trends that seem particularly material for that business. So that might be trends around biodiversity loss, so particularly for agricultural businesses. It's looking at the crops upon which your product relies may no longer be available in the places where you currently buy them, because climate change will be shifting that. There will be perhaps greater pressure on those environments. We've got growing population. So it's starting to look at those trends and really asking people to think about what the external operating environment is going to be like, let's say in 2030, and it will be very different. And so, for example, just to take a couple of stats, so the UN estimates that by 2050, up to 1 in 9 people will be displaced because of climate change. So if you think just that sheer fact alone and that flow of people, what that means for workforces, what it means for consumers, what it means for what we interpret in terms of sense of place and community, it will be incredibly different. And so asking people to move into that sort of future zone is incredibly important. So it's really around those kind of trends pieces and being able to visualize what that external operating environment might be like, and then kind of working backwards. So it's almost that kind of right to left planning in a sense, is okay, if we accept that some of these things are likely to be true 10, 20 years hence, then what do we need to do to be able to either adapt to them or to be able to stop that being some of the outcomes that we're likely to be living within if they're particularly severe.
With that focus on practical actions, particularly with the strategic view, what does the rest of the panel think?
Well, certainly, I think that's the scariest part, is to have that mindset shift and then write it down. I think that's kind of the hardest bit, is actually creating an action plan, because then you're putting pen to paper and you're committing to these targets and hopefully aligning them to, you know, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which goes to 2030, the new net zero commitment that the UK government has set forward at 2050, although hopefully a little bit sooner. But it means then that as a business, you are then committing yourself to those milestones, and you're going to have to work backwards from that. And it's really scary, but it's essential. It's that classic quote of, you know, you have to know your known knowns, your unknown knowns, and your unknown unknowns, and kind of map all of your risks of those hot spots where you might find them within your supply chain. Again, I work with retailers who, you know, we're sourcing all over the world globally. So we need to do that collectively, again, collaboratively. in order to progress and meet these ambitious targets. So I think that practical application is write it down, get your senior buy-in, work across your business to make sure that you're establishing those mindsets, that they know what the risks are, what that future looks like, and then work backwards from there.
Are there any practical examples that anyone wants to mention around an organization actually doing this in real terms?
So I think one of the really interesting things, looking obviously at scale, is that Sainsbury's delivered their largest savings in their 148-year history through the key investments that they made in sustainability. But what's really interesting when you unpick this, and I think relevant to everyone in this room, whatever size and maturity your organisation is today, is that those investments weren't purely in sort of terms of capital expenditure. Picking up this point in terms of engagement, there was basically 1,000% return on effort through employee engagement initiatives. So some of that will be on traditional things that Workspace absorb around sort of energy, waste, etc. But it was about engaging those employees in behaviour change. And critically with that, then being able to tell these really compelling stories. Because if you as a business can actually demonstrate that you've done it yourselves and you've lived those values, then the actual reputational gains through that can really bring some additional credibility to what you're delivering. And I think also we need to kind of consider the value of technology interventions. And I think everyone always tends to think at scale, again, that there needs to be significant finance. Yes, you know, obviously expenditure on things like solar PV and things have come down and the payback periods have contracted. So that really helps to build the commercial case. But equally, there is some really interesting kind of technologies out there that are actually really low cost. We've seen some great examples in retail where actually there's something called aerofoil. It's been designed for Formula One, but has now actually been applied to refrigeration units. And by introducing this tiny metal strip on the edge of chilled units, rather than having to go to the expense of putting all these doors on them, you can get a 15% reduction in energy consumption through this tiny bit of metal at a really significantly low cost. And that can save up to, I think it's about, the payback on that is within 6 months. So it is about kind of scanning the landscape and understanding what those interventions are.
I guess as part of that word of collaboration that we keep talking about, as a Workspace customer, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're part of the Leather Market Environmental Group.
Yeah.
I think that connects to, some things that you do on your end, Karen. If I remember this, so my memory's serving me well.
Yeah, no, that's right. So we've got the Leather Market Environmental Group that we're actually working with Anthesis on, and that's been going on for a year now. We set that up at the Leather Market Christmas party last year. And so we're meeting on a quarterly basis with all of the customers, and I bring along all of the energy consumption for that site, and then any particular units if we've got that information. And then also we go through our recycling figures as well. And it's a really good opportunity for me to find out from our customers what their thoughts are on how we can help them more and be more supportive as their landlord. And following the success of the Leather Market one, we've set up a new one at Kennington Environmental Group as well, which I can see some members are here tonight, which is nice.
And I think for you as well, I think you mentioned that sustainability isn't just about the environment. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're also part of the BBP, which is the Better Building Partnership. And so that's specifically for the real estate sector. And so that's a collaboration of UK commercial property companies. And we just get together to look at ways at how we can improve the built environment. And I learn a lot from our peers within that group about what we can do and what works, and we hear about best practice. And along with 23 other members of the BBP, we've now committed to become net zero by 2050. And then there's also just some examples that are not specifically on real estate. You could, we've got, various councils have their own groups as well that you could look to see if you could join them. So we're part of the Islington Sustainable Energy Partnership as well. There's also one in Camden, and there's an award ceremony this Thursday actually with ICEP and the CCA, those both partnerships, and really just showcasing small businesses in those local councils and ones that are just doing really well in terms of environmental initiatives.
So Louisa, I think the audience would love to hear about BCorp. And one of the interesting things, certainly about your appearance, is actually you represent a sustainable organization at its core. And I think if I was putting myself in the audience shoes, I would think actually this sounds nice, but actually what other practical things as a business owner I could do to really dig deep into this issue. And I wonder whether BCorp is that bridge in some way.
Right. So for those that don't know about BCorp, it is essentially a certification program, and companies have to meet minimum standards of environmental and social responsibility. Once you certify, you are then joining a community of other businesses, and there are huge amounts of benefits that come from being part of a community, collaboration being the key word on the stage, and the ability for you to be part of a movement. So a lot of the work that BCorp does is actually movement building now. I think for us, we set up the business with a really clear environmental mission, and we perhaps hadn't really considered broader, like the people side of the business, more of the social concerns. And BCorp really gave us a framework that enabled us to do a full health check across the business. So the first stage for certification is what's called a B Impact Assessment, which is free actually for any business to complete. It's available on their website. It takes probably about 2 hours to go through initially, and it runs through the 5 different pillars of BCorp, which are governance. Let me remember them all. Governance, environment, people, so workers, the supply chain and community, and your customers as well. And I think for us, I went through that assessment the first time, really clear on what we were doing on the environment, but coming to those sections, looking at the workers, for us, we were at the time 4 employees, and we were working mostly in our customers' premises, which was quite nice. We were working in the pub most of the time, but we didn't have a lot of policies around people or had really considered our broader community. So the process of going through that helped us to identify areas where we could improve. It acted as a benchmark against other companies as well who'd already been through that process. So, for example, we scored really well on the environment, which was to be expected, but we scored quite poorly on our commitment to workers. So we introduced some policies that formalised a lot of what we were doing around flexible working and our benefits programme. For example, giving formal volunteering days off and personal development days to staff, and also looked at our business structure. We were going through an equity raise at the time that we called Equity for Good, because we asked the investors to make a commitment that any net profits that they made would be reinvested in other businesses with a social mission. And through that process, we wanted to include all of our team as well. So we went through the process of ensuring that there was employee ownership behind the mission. So that was, I guess, one of the big changes that we made on the people side. But even on the environmental side, we were very clear that we were having a positive impact, because in the UK, 44% of the bread that we produce is never eaten. And that goes right through the supply chain. One of the source of bread that we use is the heel end of loaves that would usually be discarded when you make sandwiches. So if you think about going to the shop at lunchtime to buy that sandwich, that final slice of the loaf is never used. And that we're having a hugely positive impact because we're reducing the amount of malted barley that is used, and that has water, energy, land impacts, and then we're preventing the bread going to landfill. But we hadn't really done an environmental footprint and really looked at our full business impact. So even understanding what other small businesses were doing in this area and sharing tools that enabled us to put in place some of the measures was really, really helpful. And as I say, being part of that community now, we share a lot of resources. There's always somebody that I can ask for help. We're now 10 people, so still a very small team, and we do rely on our network of other businesses.
So I've been chairing these discussions for, I think, some months now, and there tends to be a rhythm to this. I think the first question is very similar to what we just did. I sort of bring you in based on the previous conversation, but I think as the panel warms up, you'll remember what I said, that actually you are the experts, and really I'm just here to facilitate, to make sure that the audience gets something really tangible from the event. So I think with that in mind, let's go to the second question, which is about sector-specific strategies with an eye of actually what can organizations outside of those specific sectors can learn. I'll just leave it there.
I'm happy to kick that off. So this is an interesting one because we do see us kind of leveraging that knowledge from one sector to another, but equally kind of signposting some of the clients that we work with, particularly who may be in kind of the startup phase, to help them identify what some of those critical issues are, particularly in the context of looking at kind of climate change, and where through their development they can have an impact. And actually, I'm thinking of a small company that I've worked with called Green Sportswear. It actually started out as Green Bikewear. And it set out originally with the purpose of using recycled PET in its clothing. And then subsequently, obviously, there's been an increase in our awareness of those microfibers entering kind of water systems. And, you know, as a small and rapidly growing business, they suddenly had to grapple with, you know, quite a serious topic based on a workforce at that time of about 4 individuals. So some of the ways that they've actually then been able to kind of leverage support in order to understand what their position is, who they need to connect with, and what they need to do about this, is that they've accessed networks like the Huddersfield Textiles Centre for Excellence. They've also been able to leverage some of the expertise through a much broader coalition called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And that is obviously within a sector, but it's enabled them to understand in terms of the energy, water, waste and chemicals that are then being used in their products, how to then look at how effectively their products in turn can be recycled. So they've started to look at a much more kind of closed loop, even though they were using secondary commodities to actually manufacture those products in the first place. So in terms of then those principles, they've had to look much more broadly outside the apparel sector to understand more what links into kind of the plastics industry, what links into the notion of taking secondary commodities, so plastic pellets from recycled bottles, linking those in, and then understanding the end of life of their own products and whether effectively those can actually be repurposed as secondary commodities and re-enter the supply chain as a raw material of some kind. And so that's necessitated engaging with things like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and looking to understand some of the wider infrastructure challenges around them realising their mission end to end and their involvement then with helping to influence some of the work around kind of government policy. So that all sounds quite complex in terms of all of those different intervention points, but by working in collaboration with other industry sector experts and then engaging outside their industry, they've been able to actually evolve those solutions and continue to realise their vision of basically continuing to grow their business of sportswear lines from recycled PET.
Yeah, I think that sustainability is such a almost scary word, and it means different things to different people, to different stakeholders, different companies. And I think it's just about understanding as your business, whether you're small, medium, or large, what that really means. And going back to the mindset, I think, I work with quite large retailers, so Ocado thought, well, our uniforms, because they have our branding on it, are never going to be recycled or used. How can we actually make sure that they don't just get sent to landfill? And so they're working with, I think, the Northumberland prison to make sure that they're, upskilling the prisoners to use these textiles, putting them into mattresses, making bags, tote bags, other things out of it that ordinarily all of that would have just been sent straight to landfill. And so it goes back again to that mindset of, if you think that something's not right and you want to do something about it, you need to just look to some of your peers, some of your other types of businesses, whether they're small, medium, or large, and think, okay, well, can I actually do something with this? Can I actually have a more circular approach to this? Can I actually divert this from landfill? How can I actually work with collaboratively again? How can I work with some of these other sectors and learn from them? And I think there's a lot out there, and it's just about elevating that up and shining more light to it. Because again, if you're talking about sustainability, you run the risk, you run the risk of it just sort of being vague, and it's about those practical applications, those solutions that you can learn from and implement. So I think that's really important to do as a business.
Yeah, totally build on what you're saying about kind of elevating up. So one of the ways that we often describe how change happens when we're working with our partners is that you've kind of got the mainstream, which is kind of business as usual and how things are now. And then change tends to happen kind of on the niches, or they're from external forces like environmental constraints. And those two things together tend to put pressure on the mainstream and force it to change. So I think really often for businesses, if they're feeling the external pressures, but they're not yet feeling very confident about what are the innovations that are happening in the niche, it's about identifying what are those things, what are the opportunities, in bioplastics, or, in a whole, things like fungus that will eat plastic waste, for example, and so on. So what are these innovations that are often relatively small scale, but they're piloted and they've been proven, and how can you start to bring those up? But when you're bringing them up, what you need to do is really look at what are the wider potential impacts so that you don't then have unforeseen negative impacts. So it's then really about doing that full assessment. But I think that opportunity to shine a spotlight on some of the incredible innovative things that are happening and how you can push those so that they become the mainstream and replace the old mainstream.
And I'd just say, I think also we need to encourage businesses to be reporting more and to be much more open and transparent about what their waste streams are, because the vital thing about the circular economy is that there's no such thing as waste. It's about adding value to us or creating a byproduct or a co-product rather than a waste stream. But often people just don't even know that waste exists. So, for example, we do a lot of collaboration so that we're teaching other breweries how to use bread, how to find these sources of surplus bread, be it a bakery or a cafe or whatever it is. And we open source a recipe as well online so that even people in their own home, if they homebrew, can produce a bread beer. And through one of the collaboration projects that we've just done with Brewdog in Tower Hill, we actually focused on Halloween and the pumpkin waste, because we discovered through working with a charity called Hubbub that every year there are millions of pumpkins that are left in the fields because they're grown purely for people to carve them for the 31st of December. And the farmers are just left with huge amounts of surplus that no one wants to buy afterwards because people don't see them as food. So we went and we gleaned them, which is an old-fashioned way of saying that you go to the farm and rather than leaving the food to rot in the field, we take it, and usually it would go to a charity or redistributed in some way. We took some of those pumpkins and we made a beer. And we had a huge pickup in the press. We were on the BBC, in The Guardian, because it was an issue that people were not really aware of, but it raised the profile of pumpkins as a waste stream. And I think it's just really important that we're able to identify these opportunities so that people who are entrepreneurs and are innovating can see those waste streams. What we're trying to look at now is the spent grain, which is the grains that are left over at the end of the brewing process, and what could be done with those. There are a couple of companies that take those spent grains and they dry them, they turn them into flour that can then be used to make bread. So it's a nice circle of loaf. There's also a company I just read about last week that's based in Somerset House that are making them into cutlery. The cutlery biodegrades within a matter of weeks. But it's just, giving people that information and encouraging people to create solutions to it.
And also eat your pumpkins, people.
It's not just for
Don't let
Halloween.
them rot.
Okay, so the part of the wider, I think, context of this issue is, I think, centered on recent findings by PR firm Edelman. I think that might be in the audience today, actually. So they looked at globally, and part of their findings was that actually the public now expect business leaders to really lead the charge on issues facing society. So I think with that in mind, I want to turn to the third question, which is really about the climate responsibilities, whether the company is large or small. What responsibilities do these organizations have, and frankly, many of the people in the room have to their employees, their communities, and their customers?
Yeah, I can start if you like. So kind of from the bigger picture perspective, I think one of those is what I mentioned just briefly earlier, is around fully understanding the implications of your actions. So if you're a company that's on that sustainability journey, you're looking to reduce your footprint, you're looking to source perhaps more sustainably, those are all really great, but they will have implications. So it's about seeing that full picture. And one of the kind of buzz phrases that's being talked about more and more is around just transition, which is talking about as we shift to, particularly to like a decarbonised economy, and we look at renewable energy sources, is there are social and economic implications that fall out of that, which is that there are communities that have been reliant on being part of, a coal-powered station, for example, that obviously is a big employer for that region. And whilst we radically need to decarbonise, that is an implication for those communities. And so how do we make sure that those transitions are comprehensive and just, and you're taking into account the full picture?
If I can just follow up on that, I think there's a really good sort of example of what we're seeing in a UK context around flooding at the moment. And this increasing recognition that this is not just about recovering from single events, given the increased frequency, it's about adaptation. And businesses working in these areas, whether you're angling water or, a small shop, trying to understand effectively how you come together to look at what that adaptation measures are in order to build future resilience to absorb these impacts. So that is about sort of ensuring business continuity, but I think it's also about ensuring that neighbourhoods are more resilient in order to ensure employee well-being, so that people can get to work, that they feel supported if there is effectively a crisis associated with a single event. So I think there's a real case here in terms of real estate and responsibility that you have beyond that direct piece of infrastructure and understanding how you work with the authorities. I was in an event this morning which was convened by the Westminster Forum, looking very much at kind of climate impact on infrastructure. And there were some really great examples actually of this community level work that's going on. I just feel that perhaps those community organisations that are working across the UK, so they're not just in isolated pockets in the UK, perhaps don't have the profile that they need. And actually, there's a real opportunity for businesses to engage more directly to influence that agenda. And in turn, that also starts to influence government policy, because we need the two things to move hand in hand.
I think it also comes down to transparency as well. and that's how you lead by example. Again, it's scary. You're going to have to put all of this down in your action plan, have those key milestones that you're going to have to meet. Excuse me. And that's how you bring your consumer, that's how you bring your employees along with you, so that they can see transparently where you're working towards. What we're doing at the moment is we're developing a sector climate roadmap, because again, it's not just for Sainsbury's and Asda and all these big guys to lead on this. You know, everybody has a part to play. Again, collaboration, I'm gonna bang on about that. But everybody has a part to play to get us to net zero emissions, to tackle the climate crisis. It's not for one business alone to do, and we're not expecting it to. But the only way that you can actually do that is to map it out, monitor it, and then implement it. And it's gonna be scary again to sort of see, okay, by 2030, where are we gonna have to be? What are we actually gonna have to implement? What policies are we gonna have to actually have as a business? Who are we gonna actually have to take along with us as employees in our whole workforce? But you only can work with what you know. So I think it's really important to transparently map that out and share it. Again, like I work with big businesses, so there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of sharing. There's a lot of tight-lipped, closed-door meetings that happen a lot. It's a very competitive space, I will say, but climate change is bigger than that. We all have to rise above that sort of competitiveness to work together to tackle it. It's necessary.
I think I build on those past comments as well. I think, like, as individuals, as people, and as businesses, we've got a responsibility to speak up and to use whatever platform that we have to be very honest about the reality of the situation we're facing. It's not climate change, there's a climate crisis, it's real, it's happening all over the world, it's happening in the UK as well. And people, like you say, are looking to businesses for leadership, but also just for honesty. People want to feel that the brands that they're buying from align with their own ethics and their own beliefs in the world. And so there's that element of being prepared to stand up for what you believe in. So Toast, we, with a number of other, mostly B Corps, but other businesses as well, we signed a declaration that we agree that there is a climate emergency. We put that out there. We went as a team to the climate strike to show that, you know, we all individually want to do something about this. At the moment, we're supporting the call for a climate debate as part of the UK election as well. I think we have had moments where we thought, should we do this? Should we, you know, take that risk? And what will our audience, what will our consumers think about it? At the end of the day, we just felt we had to do what was right. So I'd say be prepared to stand up and use whatever platform you have. And then also listen. So we talk a lot about how we have to influence others, but there are so many people that are talking to us as businesses, and not just our customers and the communities around us, but our employees as well. So we, like most of our team, is very young and they're very passionate and care about the environment, and you know, some of them know more about the situation that we're in now than our board members. So it's really important that, no, I'm sorry, don't repeat that anyway. Yeah, so it's really important that we listen to them, both to understand like for some of them, the anxiety that they're feeling and how we support them, but also to take the knowledge and the expertise and the passion that they've got to make sure that we're on the right track.
I might just quickly touch on the net zero carbon commitment that we've done with the BBP. As part of that commitment, we need to disclose our pathway towards meeting net zero by 2050. So by the end of next year, we need to show exactly how we're going to get from now until 2050 and what we need to do, how much investment is required to upgrade our assets and look at our embodied carbon as well. And as part of that work, we're also currently developing our science-based targets. So they're long-term targets that are aligned to the climate change, the latest climate change science to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. And then just to touch on your point earlier about encouraging businesses to actually speak to the government and feedback, particularly from smaller businesses as well. and to take part in their consultations and everything is very important to keep things driving forwards in the right direction as well.
So you mentioned, I guess, the competitive landscape of some of your larger retail clients, and I think that was a good reminder for me to move on to the fourth and final question before we open up to Q&A, which is really about the commercial risk. So I suspect a lot of the owners in the room and directors of organizations will say, I get all of that, but I'm in a commercial organization actually, and sort of part of my responsibility is making sure this organization grows and thrives. And actually maybe one of the reasons why this event caught my eye is that actually I recognize that this is no longer purely an environmental issue, but a deeply commercial issue that's relevant to, I think, all businesses, regardless of what sector they're in. So with that in mind, how can not only the business leaders in this room, but all business leaders best navigate the commercial risks posed by climate change?
Well, you can't operate a business on a dead planet. So, I think going back to that mindset, like you need to, in sort of project management speak, have a risk register. What's going to happen if where I'm sourcing, one of the materials floods and I can't get it? What happens if, there are forest fires where I'm trying to source XYZ material? You have to have that risk register, classic red, amber, green. Look at your red, look at where those sort of really hot spots are, and work backwards from that, because that's where your investment is going to have to be as a business, really, is if those reds start happening, you're not going to continue to operate. It's just not feasible. And I think, we talk about this climate crisis. It is real, it is happening, but it doesn't feel tangible. I think for some smaller businesses, they sort of look to the big retailers, big brands to sort of do it all for them. But again, I'm going to harp on about it. It's, collaborative effort. We all have a part to play to do it. So even a really small incremental change systemically could actually add up and could actually really help us. 2020 is going to be a big, big year for the UK. We're hosting the big climate change conference, there's a climate crisis, in November of next year. So, there's going to be a lot of platforms on this. There's going to be a lot of talk about it. So I think now is the time for you as businesses to really look how you can actually implement, make an action plan, and work towards those.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, I think I would say as business leaders in the room, act with conviction, own the issue, but keep it simple, starting with a really basic understanding of where you're likely to feel the impact and what those drivers are as a business, and mapping that out is all you need to start with. You can then look at, quantifying that impact and the scale of it, but just keep it really simple to begin with, and engage your colleagues, your staff, your workforce to help work through that with you. All of this doesn't matter whether we're working with Cisco or working with Green Sportswear. At the end of the day, your business is the best. You're hearing from your consumers, and really use that to your benefit. And then you can start to engage externally, for the support that you might need. But yeah, I would say that, acting with conviction and engaging your workforce is a really, really good starting point.
And so, our Workspace customers, as lots of you are, we're getting a lot more questions and queries from our customers and our investors about what we're doing as a responsible landlord. Our customers are asking us where we're getting our energy from, where is their waste and recycling going, and our investors are also asking really detailed questions now on our risks and opportunities associated with climate change. I had a phone call with an investor recently for half an hour, just specifically asking us about TCFD, so Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and all about our risks and opportunities and what we're doing about them, and how we're disclosing them. And so we really need to show you guys, our customers, and our investors that we're doing what we can to mitigate our environmental impact. and just show that we're taking climate change very seriously.
So there are a couple of points before I kick open to Q&A that I just quickly wanted to touch on. One of the things that I found, I think, really interesting as part of our preliminary discussion was actually the impact this issue has on, I guess, two things. Access to finance, but also, I suppose, the valuations for organizations and the way in which investors and consumers and employees now look to businesses differently based on what they do in this space. So I guess with both the regulatory environment in mind, access to finance, but also I guess the need for business owners to understand what's going to impact their valuation if they're raising money, where does these issues intersect?
Yeah, so I think Karen sort of touched on it in terms of these questions that are coming from the investor community. We do a lot of work with private equity, so we're sort of seeing it through their lens. So they often kind of having this push down from pensions funds, or even if they are raising capital through private individuals, so family trusts, etc., they're now being asked to demonstrate, particularly for the pension funds, what they're doing to reduce their exposure to fossil fuels, and also what they're doing in terms of wider, as they put it, social value creation. So how are the wider communities in which those businesses are based benefiting from them and their activities? So, you know, from an infrastructure perspective, there's a framework now called GRESB that looks at real estate, so the built environment. It looks at infrastructure and has a simple kind of benchmarking questionnaire. And that's one example, but it means you get a flood of questions coming your way. So this goes back to Louisa's point around being prepared. So actually looking at what you are setting as clear goals, what those targets are, how you're going to measure progress to those goals. So it could be as simple as a carbon footprint, or looking at your water consumption or your well-being program, and measuring progress over the course of 12 months, and then being in a position where you can disclose that. It doesn't have to be a lengthy report, you know, it could be a couple of pages. For those of you who are a bit more evolved, you might want to look at something like the UNGC Global Compact framework, because again, that's 10 key principles. And then, you know, alternatively, you might want to look at things like BCorp. But all of those are good mechanisms. But this is, as you say, you know, these pressures are increasing. We'll start to see for larger companies that these start to get mandated. And for those of you that are growing at scale and very rapidly, you know, better to get on the front foot now, because it'll be much easier than trying to retrofit a load of this stuff further down the line.
I guess, and I'm not mentioning South Africa because I've sort of booked my vacation there for November, but I remember, Louisa, you had a really interesting example around South African part. And the reason why I mention it, because actually it highlights that this issue, while in some ways rooted in the environment, isn't really just about the environment. Remind me what you said.
So yes, it's like we have to be prepared, but we also have to be prepared for the things that you can't be prepared for. So we collaborate with breweries all over the world, and we have a partnership with a brewery based in Cape Town. And last year, when they were suffering the drought, as they were approaching day zero, we realised that we were in a very difficult situation because we'd contracted a brewery to brew beer for us, and brewing is very water intensive. So if anyone says to you, save water by drinking beer, they're lying. It takes between 3 to 10 pints of water to make a pint of beer, depending on how efficient the brewery is. So it would have been socially irresponsible for us to continue brewing beer while there was not enough water for people to be drinking. We wanted to consider maybe brewing in Joburg or somewhere else, but we were contractually bound, so we weren't able. That wasn't an option to us, and we decided that if we continued to move to that situation of day zero, what we would do was simply bottle water and distribute that. So what I would say is, in terms of being prepared, also be really clear about your purpose and how would you respond to unknown situations like that, and make sure that whatever response you take is aligned with your brand and your business. And for us, that the environmental and social impact of the drought coming together we felt that it would be irresponsible of us as a business.
Okay, so I'd like to throw this open to the audience, and please do start thinking of your questions. They're part of my team going to come around with the microphones. I'm particularly keen to hear who you are and what organization you represent, and whether or not you're directing your question to a particular person or persons or the entire panel. Before I do that, and you can sort of think about your question, I'd like the entire panel to briefly tell me a podcast or book on this topic that you're read or you're reading that the audience should take back and read or listen to themselves. You don't have to go first, Fiona. You're sitting next to me, but you're welcome to if you'd like to.
Okay. I'll kick off. I've made a trip from Bristol this evening. That said, I do spend about half of my working week in London. But there are a great couple of folk there, Livy and Jess, who've set up a podcast called Woke and Confused. And I love it because basically they delve into modern day sort of dilemmas to explore what those solutions to those sustainability dilemmas might be. And from their perspective, as they say, it gets into the heart of what it means to be woke millennial in a changing climate. And I'm taking up too much time, but there's a great example of some ants getting in the kitchen, and I'll leave it with you in terms of what you might do, and you can listen to them to hear what their response was.
So Louisa mentioned Hubbub earlier, and so they've got a new podcast called What on Earth, and that's a really good podcast. I think there's only about six so far, and they're starting their next lot of them, and they basically talk about the past, present and future for each one, and they cover topics on air pollution, sustainable eating, fast fashion, so you can sort of pick and choose what you're interested in, but I've listened to all of them and I'd highly recommend. And then in terms of a book, I mean, I like to read lots of articles, and on Property Week or the EG. But Greta Thunberg's speeches, that's a great little book, and it doesn't take very long to read, and it's very inspiring.
Well, I'm a New Yorker originally, and so I would say this, but I love NPR, the National Public Radio, and they have really nice sort of bite-sized 20 to 30-minute podcast episodes on the environment. Really great for your commute if you're just sort of just cycling, just to sort of listen to it. They tackle about anything from flooding to air pollution and beyond.
Do you listen to podcasts when you're cycling?
Okay. I meant spin cycling. Studio contained. No, I don't cycle. I'm too scared to in London. But also I listen to The Daily by New York Times. It's a great podcast, wider than just environmental. So sorry, panel chair, for doing that, but a really good way to sort of keep up to date on everything. And then, sorry, one last one, because I do love podcasts. Wardrobe Crisis by Claire Press, who's Vogue Australia's sustainability editor. Is a great podcast on sort of the fashion sustainability, and she interviews some really, really great people about where fashion's going and heading to.
My podcast recommendation is called Good Foodies, and it's basically a couple that interview people who have started their own business, entrepreneurs that are working in the food space. So they talk to lots of small businesses, but also people that work in services that support as well, and just lots of very interesting stories to hear from some of the brands that you'll know and love and some that you will discover for the first time. And my book is called Drawdown by Paul Hawken, and there's a whole project Drawdown. They have a website, so you don't even have to read a book. And they've basically looked at 100 projects that can save the planet, and looked at the economic case for each of those and the impact that they can have. And addressing food waste comes out as number 3.
And it now comes in podcast format.
So my podcast is Solvable, which covers a whole range of topics, but essentially tries to demonstrate that some of the world's biggest problems are indeed solvable, which is nice because working in this space can be quite bleak. So it can be nice to hear an uplifting example. My book is called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger, and it is essentially around how important it is to frame the question in the right way to get innovative and breakthrough answers. And I really recommend it if you're running kind of workshops and so on. It's got some great examples of that.
Okay, questions? So.
Hello, I'm Paul Barlow from L&Co. We're a Workspace tenant, and we're also a B Corporation. I'm interested to hear your views. Obviously, we're all business leaders, and we've talked about business, but particularly on this evening, it'd be nice to know, what role the government plays in this, because I know Jonathan Porritt from Forum for the Future, he very much believes this has got to be led by government policy. As a B Corporation, I think we've got to be doing our bit too, but I'd be interested to know your views.
That's the entire panel or individual?
Entire panel.
Okay.
Well, however much time we've got.
Okay.
I could answer quickly. So the government are considering, so the consultation that they're looking at the minute is about bringing the minimum energy efficiency standard, which is currently an E, up to a B by 2030. And that will really drive the real estate industry to be upgrading all of their assets. 'Cause it's difficult to get a B, especially an older building. To get that up to a B, it will need a considerable amount of investment. And I think the minimum energy efficiency standards at the minute, just to get up to an E, has really driven a lot of energy efficiency projects across the real estate industry. But you're right, they need to be more ambitious and do more. But then the other thing was for planning permission in London, buildings need to be a particular BREEAM rating, so BREEAM Excellent, for example. This one's a BREEAM Excellent building. And that does drive a lot of energy efficiency and help in terms of environmental impacts.
I think also picking up on a point that Louisa made earlier, get involved in these public consultations. There are two key areas that we're working in, two key spaces at the moment. One is actually being paper cup recycling, and the recognition there that whilst the technology solutions actually exist to separate the plastic core from the paper exterior, the infrastructure is not there at scale to actually distribute that waste product to those plants in order for that process to take place. So we've actually been able to convene, key businesses who are actually saying, look, the solution exists. We're just really struggling to get, this sort of potential secondary commodity, produced. So there they have actually been engaging directly with government to help the government understand what investment is needed, and that might be, through public and private financing, but also what kind of timescales that needs to be on, etc. So they've been very much engaged in shaping that policy and agenda, because these policies, they're there, albeit that our cycle of governance is, every 5 years, around, with the exception of right now. Those policies can often continue to exist for 5-10 years. And so if you don't get in early enough, then you do actually risk losing out on shaping that agenda. And we're actually seeing it on another packaging type, around a biocompostable packaging type at the moment, where we're really urging the partner that we're working with to get into these consultations. Because if they don't influence it, then you can bet your bottom dollar that actually the plastics industry, which has a much stronger lobbying power, will find a reason for putting forward their solution over the kind of biocompostables. So, however small you are, you have a voice, you're going to need the evidence base. And I would say that's the really critical thing. Make sure you've got the analytics that stack up and prove the case.
So one thing remains true, I suppose, throughout all these events that I've chaired, is that never seems to be enough time for audience Q&A. So I wonder whether the audience will indulge me slightly. So technically, we're meant to end now, and there will be dinner waiting, and you can certainly speak to the panelists directly if you so choose. But I wonder whether the audience would prefer to spend an extra 15 minutes firing questions to the panel. So those are your two options. So I guess with a raise of hands, who would prefer to stay an extra 15 minutes and ask questions? Okay. And who would prefer to go into dinner and speak to everyone directly? Oh, stop!
You know that there's wine, right?
Yeah, no, okay, so, you know, we're doing
You
first.
are putting a barrier to
So, you know,
that.
for that, you're doing option one. Anyone has any other questions? Ma'am, in the back. Yep. Ma'am. Yep, I can see her. Yep.
Yeah, last time I checked, I wasn't.
No, ma'am, right there. I think she had her hand
okay.
up. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
It was me.
Was it you? Okay, let's go with you.
Thank you. So everyone's talking about supply chains and renewables and stuff, but the state I come from in India is Jharkhand. It's northeastern state, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this. It's the biggest mining state in India, and a lot of people know India for coal because they've done a big deal with Australia last year. But when I follow the supply chain to the west in terms of the products, and look at the supply chain, who's mining? Most of the people in India and Africa who are in the mines, there are men, most of them are going to be women and young girls. The young girls end up in the sex slave trade. Those minerals, the lithium, the cobalt, the bauxite, up to 200 minerals, are not turned into a coal power plant. They're turned into electric cars, wind turbines, solar panels, smart meters, to wire up my fridge so it can tell me if I've got enough fruit in the fridge, to my phone. Something as absurd as that. My question is that none of this is green. And the people who are impoverished and suffering the most is in India, where their water tables are collapsing. So I'd like to see, considering the panel said stand up and say what you really believe in, your conviction, I'd like to see some justifiable answers as to why the people that need to be helped the most are bleeding their knuckles right now in the global south. And how has that actually ever not been entertained as the conversation in all these meetings on sustainability?
Yeah, so just remind me where you're from and what organization
My
you're from,
name is Sagar Sumaria, Holistic Economy, because circular economy is not even a circle, it's only half of it. But that's what I'm doing, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
And there's no transparency. When the water tables in India collapsing...
Sorry, what was the name of the organization?
Holistic Economy.
Yeah, and your name, sir?
Sagar Sumaria.
Okay, so a slightly provocative question, but there's certainly an element of truth actually to the core point that he's making.
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it absolutely should be, because I think it is one of the things that gets glossed over when we talk about sustainability solutions, and if we're not looking at the whole picture, we absolutely run the risk of creating more new problems or perpetuating existing ones. And the global system that we are within is one where there are massive imbalances of power, and the system tries to retain those because those companies, countries, individuals who are in power have risen to that because they're benefiting from the system. And so you have to absolutely be asking those challenging questions. And like your point about electric vehicles, yeah, there are negative implications of those, and we need to be looking at those before we go wholesale into that. And it's not that they might not represent a better alternative, certainly from a decarbonisation perspective they do, but unless you look at those other social and economic and cultural and racial disparity impacts, we are going to risk just moving into another unsustainable system.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a completely valid point. It needs to be addressed. Going back to what I was saying about the risk register, these are the risks that big companies, well, any company where you're sourcing from needs to be addressed. Talking about, just putting a one-size-fits-all solution to the climate crisis will not work. And it also shouldn't scare people to really look at it in depth. Again, the transparency is you're talking directly to your suppliers, you're harmonizing those asks as a sector, as an industry with other industries if you can. talking about, wind turbines, and, that still uses steel, and, steel is really coal intensive. So again, these questions need to be asked, they need to be addressed. We need to be talking to government. Again, took 45 minutes to talk about Brexit. Government does have a role to play in this, and we need to be addressing them to talk to other governments around the world to do that. So it's, again, everybody has a part to play in this, and we shouldn't just be brushing it under the rug. We need to have really sort of evocative questions like that. How can I address that? Well, that means that, I need to go talk to my supplier that's based there and hear firsthand, and not just assume that I have all the answers, based here in London. It's really trying to amplify the voices of those people that are living it and doing that for us.
Okay, I'd like to push on, just in the interest of time, get some other questions in. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, ma'am, the original ma'am. So perfect, thank you.
Hello, I'm Nadia. I'm from Hex Studio, we're a Workspace customer, do branding, creative. We work a lot with brands at the sort of stage in their life where they're understanding who they are and what story they tell consumers. And there's quite a general consensus that, consumers are paying for brands that they think are standing up for stuff that governments perhaps aren't. But I don't know, perhaps looking at Louisa as a product-based company, whether there's any kind of financial resources or stats, if we're kind of far enough along yet to actually say, consumers actually are. There's these studies that have gone into it, and it's not just kind of a general thought so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are studies that show that people care more about sustainability and that they're voting with their wallets. We're certainly seeing that for a small and young business, we're nearly 4 years old, we've experienced huge success because our whole business model and the way we talk, so it isn't just the fact that we're brewing with bread and we're giving to charity, we're also trying to engage people in the conversation and change behaviour. It's the idea that it is a message in a bottle, it is a lubricant for social conversations, and we're certainly seeing people who maybe we wouldn't have expected before to be engaging in the issue, starting to question things like the idea that this fresh bread is going to waste, like these pumpkins are left in the field. It's human nature to start questioning that, and then to move beyond that to look at the broader issues and to be angry about the sense of injustice that is inherent in my experience, the food system. It's designed for profit. It isn't designed to feed people, and certainly not to nourish the planet in the way that we produce food. So I'd say yes, from the customer perspective, we're also seeing through engagement on social media that people are increasingly calling out businesses who are maybe they're doing some positive things, but the rest of the business really, all these greenwash campaigns by BP, where they're talking about how they're doing something positive, but really the actual business itself is having a hugely destructive impact on the planet. And people are more willing to call that out now and to identify it, even to see the disparity in these green messages that these companies are putting out, and to really make them respond to that.
Okay, let's get another question in. Sir?
Hi there. My name's John. Amongst other things, I help people build brands, and for me, there's a very important factor which is like consumer pull. So people actually wanting to make small steps, increasing steps towards more sustainable lifestyles. So my question is quite pragmatic. I just recently started to develop a brand which I wanted to develop basically low impact, more sustainably produced reusables to try to immediately take things out of single-use waste like coffee cups, water bottles. Mm-hmm. What I found myself in a route to China for sourcing. Mm-hmm. And then it took me an age to get clarity on truth, honesty, etc., etc. So, for businesses like mine that are really nascent and embryonic, where are the networks that I can tap into to find, for example, more local, sustainable supply of materials, manufacturing, and so on? Because I really appreciate what the panel's saying, but it feels like so above my head, it's unbelievable. I want to find a product that my customers can believe in, that I can believe in, and that will be, something reliable that can help people make a positive impact on the environment.
That will be the final question, so let's make that a
Right,
good one.
I'll keep it short.
Yeah.
There's something called the Circular Economy Club. Join that, go along to their events. BCorp do a social every month, go along to that, talk to people there. And yeah, there are lots of businesses. So my point earlier about us needing to publish more information and be transparent about waste in the system so that we can find these materials. There are businesses that are able to do that. So there's a really nice one called Elvis and Cress. I don't know if people know that, but they take old fire hoses and they make them into luxury bags. And I'm not finding you your supplier, so I'm not particularly helpful. But these sources do exist. There are so many innovations happening in design schools and universities where people are looking at alternative materials. Hopefully some of those networks could be useful, but I'd love to connect and then I can share my contacts with you.
Yeah. And I think on that point, let's end it there. Leah, the wine awaits. So the next event that we have will be the 30th of January at Cadogan Park. And certainly one of the things that you may have in your hands or under your seat is Workspace's Homework magazine. So certainly I think the editor of Homework is sitting here. Anyone that wants to talk about that magazine, how to get involved, please see Farah. As well, there's an interesting piece, I think on page 44, called Green Up Your Brand. It very much relates to what we're talking about. And certainly there are members of the Workspace team, in addition to Karen in the audience. And certainly, yes, please raise your hand, sit in the back. I'm Anisha. Anyone that wants to talk about what Workspace are doing more broadly, not just sustainability, please go see them. And then I guess equally well, the panel will be here at least until 8:30. So please don't be afraid to go up and say hello, find out more information. But I suppose, and most importantly, I'd like to thank the panel for their time and their expertise. It's been a pleasure.